Okay, we're on.
Okay, welcome back. Gavin and I are here to discuss the last couple of chapters from Richard Wrangham's book, The Goodness Paradox, A Strange Relationship Between Virtue and Violence in Human Evolution. And today we'll be talking about chapters 12 and 13. Chapter 12 addresses war, where the application, basically what Wrangham's doing here is applying some of these ideas specifically mostly to modern warfare, and the extent to which, and he's sort of asking whether or not some of these ideas that he's presented in the previous chapters, have any applicability to modern war and the ways in which modern war is conducted.
Right, and also sort of distinguishing between the different types of war in a sense that's, relevant to what he's been talking about, right?
Yes, absolutely. You mean, are you referring to the distinction between like raids and war?
Right, which he mentions that some anthropologists don't even think should be considered warfare in the same sense as most modern warfare.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is a contingent within modern anthropology that, basically wants to argue that warfare is not part of our evolutionary history. I think on the as he discusses in this chapter, there seems to be a misunderstanding that if we have an evolutionary history of warfare, well, then war is inevitable. But of course, that's not true. I mean, that something is part of our evolutionary history doesn't mean that we are compelled to behave in that way. Nor does it make, another confusion is that if war is part of our evolutionary history, it therefore is a natural phenomenon and is therefore a good phenomenon. But that also is a problematic, logical sort of conclusion. That something is part of our evolutionary history and therefore natural doesn't therefore make it good. We do lots of things to try to stop or thwart or decrease behaviors that are part of our evolutionary history and therefore are natural that we don't like. Things like child abuse and spousal abuse and sexual coercion and rape. And these are behaviors that all of the evidence suggests are part of our evolutionary history, but are behaviors that most societies today regard as abhorrent and not acceptable. So, at any rate, why don't we just kind of launch in? And I think the first couple of paragraphs set up this chapter nicely. I don't know that we want to spend time with the details, but I do want to sort of make sure we hit the main issues and themes in this chapter. So he begins this chapter, this is right on page 248. So right at the beginning of the chapter 12. He says, humans are often said to be intensely tribal. Okay, indeed we are. But if tribal refers to a sense of solidarity with a large social group, the same is true of most primates. Okay, tribalism does not distinguish us, nor does reactive aggression, given that we've discussed that reactive aggression occurs in many other social species, wolves, chimpanzees, and so forth. It is coalitionary proactive aggression that makes our species and societies truly unusual. Among our ancestors, coalitionary proactive violence, planful, violence committed by a group of typically adult males, against others, coalitionary proactive violence directed at members of their own social groups enabled self-domestication, according to his argument, and the evolution of the moral sense, again, according to Wrangham's argument, by virtue of, or in line with the execution hypothesis, right? Now, according to Wrangham, it enables the functioning of states. Unfortunately, it also gives our species war, caste, the butchery of helpless adults, and many other forms of irresistible coercion, which takes us back to his arguments regarding overwhelming power in the previous chapter. So Wrangham continues. He says, The reason coalitionary proactive aggression enables these despotic behaviors is straightforward. A coalition of proactive human aggressors can choose when and how to be aggressive to their victims in such a well-planned way that they can achieve their goal with overwhelming force and without risking their own safety. As long as the victim cannot assemble a defense, the ability to plan with clinical detachment gives a coalition extraordinary power. Success in removing opponents is predictable and cheap. And that sets us up for the application of these, principles, basically, to modern warfare.
And I think part of what he is doing in this chapter is explaining that war, contrary to, like you said, the people who think that if war is part of our evolutionary history, then it's inevitable, and also contrary to the anthropologists who think that warfare didn't define, early human tribal civilizations. Wrangham is instead arguing that war very much makes sense with what he's been arguing throughout the book so far, which is that at least the tribal form of warfare, is very parsimonious with our low reactive and high proactive aggression.
Yeah, I mean, low reactive aggression relative to our in-group members, right? But high proactive aggression, which can be applied, this proactive aggression, coalitionary proactive aggression, can be applied to within group members and has been applied in the form of the execution hypothesis. But he's also arguing that it's that very coalitionary proactive aggression that provides, the wherewithal to engage in intergroup violence and raiding. I mean, basically, the same group of adult males who execute troublemakers within the group can carefully and, as he says, with clinical detachment, plan the raid of a competing group.
Right.
And do so in a way that, where they risk very little. And this is exactly why these raids, which are incredibly common, okay, in tribal societies, in hunter-gatherer societies, why they're typically done at night, okay, when members of the enemy group are sleeping, or done very early in the morning, and the idea is to catch them by surprise with overwhelming power, okay, to do the damage you can as quickly as possible and then get out. Why get out? Because you don't want to risk injury or death. So one of the things he spends some time on right at the beginning here is he makes the argument, as he says on page 251, he says, let's see, he says the key question is whether, if our ancestors were adapted for war in the Pleistocene, that is, over the past million years or so, whether we are biologically driven to conduct war today. As I will explain, Wrangham says, my answer is that while war is not inevitable, conscious effort is needed to prevent it. It's something we have to actively be aware of, our predilection for, our interest in, our motivations to pursue war. That is, to use planful methods of attacking enemy groups. There is a risk, and there's a risk because it's been a successful pursuit over our evolutionary history. And so in order to, we want to, according to Wrangham, we want to be, very aware of this sort of the attraction of pursuing coalitionary proactive aggression.
Right. And I think he makes a distinction that is sort of helpful for understanding that, because I think he does distinguish between, the allure of war, at least, more modern forms of warfare for, leaders and generals, the heads of armies, rather than the individual members of those armies themselves.
yeah, I mean, it is an important distinction, and he does talk at some length in this chapter. I'm not finding it exactly where it is at the moment, but where he's referring to, well, he actually makes the argument that modern warfare, that there's unlikely to be adaptations that have evolved to motivate modern warfare in terms of, leaders and generals, basically commanding from behind the scenes, commanding basically uninterested soldiers, soldiers who don't have, a dog in this fight. They're doing their duty, but I mean, they don't have family members, for example, who have been captured by enemy groups. And a lot of modern warfare is, involves a leadership that commands behaviors of soldiers on the ground. And there's a profound disconnect between the leaders and the soldiers. I mean, they're not all from the same family, for example, as ancestrally that may have been the case. And so this produces all sorts of bumps in the road, for the conduct of modern warfare. And people have discussed, those various bumps and issues and concerns. And Wrangham has a nice section on a phenomenon that he himself and his colleagues identified, or at least did some really interesting work on over the last decade, something that he calls military incompetence, which is basically, sort of the application. Well, it's not that it's unique to modern warfare, but it's something that can happen when there's a disconnect between the leadership, the commanders in warfare, and sort of the boots on the ground. At any rate, let's not jump there just yet.
Okay.
One of the things I wanted to sort of raise at this point was there's a really interesting section that starts on page 257 where he basically, let's see if I can find a way to jump into it sensibly. Let's see. Maybe it's on page 256. So he's talking about simple warfare among hunter-gatherers, for example. And he notes that although simple warfare is more complex than chimpanzee intergroup aggression, its adaptive logic is nevertheless much the same. Aggressors organize their raids. This is hunter-gatherer warfare, simple warfare, he calls it. They organize their raids so as to minimize their risk of getting hurt. Usually the main aim is to kill. Reducing the number and proximity of rivals is likely to lead to benefits. The benefits could include a reduced risk of being attacked in the future or more access to neighboring resources. Whatever motivates an attack, if the neighboring group is weakened, the killers will likely end up doing better. And then he says, while the most likely outcome of a raid is total, because raids are undertaken only when the attackers have overwhelming force, there is always a chance of failure. So he goes on to say, ritual practices may be used in preparation for the attack. Raids might accrue benefits such as capturing women or taking heads. Anticipated rewards may take the form of prestige or goods. In some societies, cowards may be punished. Then he goes on to ask or note that the harder behavior to explain, that is over just, going all out into war, the harder behavior to explain is when the act of killing is its own reward. This is kind of an interesting section. He notes that in the New Guinea Highlands, an Anga horticulturalist told the anthropologist Polly Weisner how his people felt about killing in small-scale war. And basically, they're just absolutely enthralled when they kill. I mean, it's like an ecstasy that they experience. And they have their, sort of have flashes of reminders of the greatness of their family and, paying homage to their ancestors. And he goes on to say similar accounts in which warriors perceive no benefits other than the thrill of making a kill are, from an evolutionary perspective, we can explain their action as we can. We can explain their action as we can among animals. He says, why do they kill? The unnerving answer that makes biological sense is that they enjoy it. So here he makes the case that humans may have evolved, a specific enjoyment of inflicting death on the enemy. Evolution has made the killing of strangers pleasurable. He probably should have said the killing of strangers in the context of war or raids, pleasurable, because those that like to kill tended to receive adapted benefits. And this is kind of a scary thought. And he says, let me just finish this section right here. He says, at first glance, this idea might seem absurd. None of us would ordinarily find pleasure in killing a stranger. But the strangers that any of us is likely to meet are very different from the strangers met by a warrior in a small-scale society living in an anarchic world. That is, the societies in which we evolved. Using cues such as the stranger's dress and dialect, the warrior can tell at once whether or not the stranger is part of his society. A true stranger, a member of a hostile neighboring society, will probably be regarded as non-human and is liable to be as dangerous to the warrior as the warrior is to him. To enjoy a successful attack, Wrangham says, makes grisly sense. When every group relies on its own strength for protection, reducing the power of the neighbors brings rewards. I thought that was kind of interesting. And he goes on to talk about the deep joy of killing that's been written about in various warring contexts. Did you find that section kind of interesting?
Yeah, I also found it interesting and a little unsettling. I think the adaptive logic makes really good sense. Like you said, the benefits accrued from killing a hostile member of another group were probably considerable, so it makes sense that there would be at least some neurological reward for a successful kill. I'm not sure how much evidence there is to support that. Like I said, it makes good adaptive logic, but I don't know if there's been any hard data on whether or not anything neurologically is going on during those kinds of kills, or just the idea that there's something special or something different about killing a hostile member of another group versus killing a stranger in a more modern context. Because I think the details for me get a little hairy there.
Well, I think it's true. I think you're right that there is no good, as far as I know, I don't know that there's any empirical study of this phenomenon. Certainly, there are hundreds, probably thousands of anecdotes, right, of interviews with soldiers, interviews with warriors about their experiences. And he makes reference to this on 258. He says, at the top, page 258, he says, the notion that humans evolved to enjoy killing unknown enemies is unpleasant and inimical to our ordinary view of humanity. He says, we can hope that it will become increasingly irrelevant to the human future, given that our species is already largely unified by worldwide social connections. Unconnected enemies are already rare. But he says, where the social divide is sufficient, however, occasional outbursts of killing still seem to manifest a deep joy of killing. Then he goes on to say that he makes reference to Joanna Burke. So he says, the historian Joanna Burke wrote of atrocities on all sides in the Second World War. A Japanese soldier remembered Nanking. This is played out in hundreds of similar historical war sorts of books and papers. So a Japanese soldier remembered Nanking, quote, when we were bored, we had some fun killing Chinese, buried them alive or pushed them into a fire or beat them to death with clubs or killed them by other cruel means, end quote. In Europe in the 1940s, members of the collaborationist Croatian Ustasi movement enthusiastically killed Jews, Serbs, and Gypsies, quote, often hacking them to death with primitive implements, and so on. So you're right that I don't think there's what we have are historical anecdotes and interviews with soldiers, but we don't have detailed information about, certainly not about the biology of what's going on or the neurology or the, endocrinology. But, not only that, but we don't have any sort of empirical data on the psychology of what's going on, other than, these anecdotes, which are fairly common, this ecstasy that's reported by warriors. So it strikes me as an interesting area for future work, really.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Yeah, so then he let's see. He moves on and he basically sort of asks to what extent we might expect modern warfare to reflect specialized adaptations, that were selected in our very recent past, to operate according to principles of modern warfare. And he basically argues that that's unlikely, given that not enough time has passed. And I think that's probably right. But what he says is on page 260, towards the middle of the page there, he says, natural selection has doubtless honed our ability to use coalitionary proactive aggression to advantage during our long evolutionary history of simple warfare. I think that's a very reasonable argument. Then he says, whether the much shorter history of complex warfare also affected our evolutionary psychology is unknown. And I would argue it's very unlikely. It's just not enough time has passed for modern warfare or complex warfare, a history of complex warfare to have, to be reflected in specialized psychological adaptation. That kind of special design typically takes much longer time to build a psychology.
Right. No, I agree.
So at any rate, he then goes on to discuss, various phenomena in the context of modern warfare, including his this argument about military incompetence, which I guess he didn't originate, but he sort of made it a much more well-known phenomenon. This is on page 264. Essentially, so he says military incompetence was a term used by the psychologist Norman Dixon to refer to protagonists losing even when they expect to win. So basically, military incompetence is, describes, sort of bumbling into battles where, one group has no business, even getting involved in, a battle because they're all but guaranteed to lose. But there's a certain psychology that's expressed that suggests that these military leaders are moving their troops, typically their soldiers, into this battle despite the odds, despite the terribly low likelihood of success. And this is something that has occurred many times. I mean, a classic example is the Bay of Pigs invasion, the failed invasion of the Bay of Pigs by John F. Kennedy. And so he sort of addresses how can this happen, where, in 2020 hindsight, it's like only an idiot would go into battle under these circumstances, given, the weight of the evidence that you're not going to win. And I don't know that, we know this occurs. Okay, we know this happens. And one of the possible explanations, there is something to be said. There are benefits to be gained by going into battle with, unshakable confidence, with absolute certainty that you're going to win. Once you step foot on the battlefield, you better step foot with a psychology that motivates you to presume you're going to overrun the enemy. The problem is both sides think this, and that's just as true for the overwhelming favorite, factually speaking, as it is for the overwhelming, likely loser. So military incompetence is super predictable. It's not something that we know much about, in terms of hunter-gatherer raids. I think in part because these raids are typically committed when there's, it's at night, it's under the cover of darkness, and so there are those sorts of, variables at play. But it's in modern warfare where you see these instances of so-called military incompetence. And then he goes on to say that there's this guy Dixon who's done a lot of work on this previously, so using historical records. And Dixon identifies the four main symptoms of incompetence governing the outcome of battles, and these include overconfidence, underestimation of the enemy, ignoring intelligence reports, and the wastage of manpower. Um, it is a very strange state of affairs where, nobody wants to say, oh my God, they have 10 times the number of people that we do, number of potential combatants, because to do so would shake the confidence, and nobody wants to shake the confidence. And so you get in this weird place where everybody knows and yet nobody knows because nobody's saying anything, and presumes that since nobody's saying anything, well, then everybody, presumes that everybody else must know something I don't know. And you find, the generals of, or the leaders of large troops sending their troops into a bloodbath, because they wouldn't dare question the confidence or righteousness, of their side.
So it seems like what Wrangham is trying to do in this section is explain this phenomenon of military incompetence, from the perspective that modern warfare is so different from the type of warfare we evolved to engage in. Is that your understanding?
I think that's a very reasonable takeaway. Here are the various foibles and problems that can occur when our psychology, which evolved to motivate raids, coalitionary, proactive, aggressive raids, when that same psychology is applied in a modern warfare context. That's one way to think about what he's talking about here.
Okay.
I mean, I don't recall him talking about military incompetence in the context of hunter-gatherer raids.
No, I don't think he did. I'm just trying to, make sense of.
Yeah. Well, that would be consistent with what you're suggesting right now. I mean, I don't see any discussion. I think that's just it, is that military incompetence is something that emerges or can emerge in modern warfare in a way that doesn't emerge in raids. I mean, I think part of the issue is that, raids are they're a particular way of conducting warfare. I mean, it's not a protracted battle. It's not a battle. In fact, he does make the distinction between raids and battles. Raids are basically, a group of men getting together under the cover of darkness and surprising, the enemy. I mean, it's not a protracted battle where two sides are coming together at a known time, that kind of thing. That rarely happens in hunter-gatherer groups. And when it does happen, when one group goes in and realizes that the other group, for example, they're planning a raid and they go in for a raid, and then the other group has, expected this. Well, then you have both sides fired up and ready. And then in these cases, both sides typically disperse after, a bunch of, aggressive displays and, sort of yelling and screaming. Nothing actually typically happens.
Right.
But of course, in modern warfare, things do happen because you have a leadership that is commanding soldiers who have no genetic stake and no, intimate ties to the leadership in the same way that ancestrally would have been the case. And they're basically told, no, you're going to go in, and they have to follow orders. And in fact, he makes reference to this business of, there's one place where he talks about, I just looked at it and I was going to bring it up. The hierarchy, the structure is very rigid, and and modern warfare makes possible expectations of obedience, and an almost insensible commitment to the hierarchy, and those who do not follow commands are branded traitors, and historically, have been put to death We don't see that kind of thing happening in coalitionary proactive aggression in hunter-gatherer tribes. So, again, it's modern warfare that allows for, the emergence of things like military incompetence, expectations of obedience, and a hierarchy that is, rigid and expected to be respected at every level. Okay. So ultimately, he also, towards the end of the section on the application of these ideas to modern warfare, he points out something that we just discussed a few minutes ago, the potential benefits of the positive illusions of, which sort of are the basis for something like military incompetence. This almost obscene, sort of sense by the leadership that, no, they're going to win. They will win. Okay. And they just ignore all the evidence that suggests they won't win, and all the evidence suggests they're not prepared. They'll push forward, and he argues that, he says the positive illusions that carried the United States into a war of their choosing were clearly a disaster in the case of the Bay of Pigs and some of these other circumstances. So he says, but they are typical of the thinking that tends to shape the approach to escalated battles. We're not talking about raids, we're talking about battles. And they raise the evolutionary question, why do we have them? Why do we have these, these positive illusions? Why are we susceptible, or why is the leadership susceptible to these positive illusions? And he says that the psychology of reactive aggression suggests an answer. Unlike asymmetrical encounters, the decision to go into battle against a roughly equivalent or equal opponent, roughly equal, again, not taking into account whether one side is more committed or religiously motivated or any of that stuff. The decision to go into battle against a roughly equal opponent is made by opposing commanders, each of whom expects serious resistance. In this context, confidence matters. The more confidence, the more likely it is that a combatant will win. The principle applies to animals as it does to humans. Two reasons stand out: focus and bluff. So the idea that, intense confidence gives you, laser-like focus on a mission. It doesn't mean you're going to win, but it can put you in positions where, you get obliterated. Almost, you can't imagine, getting obliterated, but then you do. And then he talks about, so focus and bluff. So he says the second benefit of self-confidence is that it can create fear in the enemy. Often a good bluff is sufficient. So there's, some, this sounds to me like sort of byproducts of adaptations that evolved to solve other problems, are taken advantage of in modern warfare contexts, or are putting modern armies into conflicts in which one side is all but guaranteed to lose. But they go in, with this unwarranted confidence and focus. So at any rate, okay. Now, ultimately, sort of moving through, sort of the problems of modern warfare and, noting that, the application of an evolved psychology for coalitionary proactive aggression in the ancestral context, must be what is applied in the modern warfare context, given that there hasn't been enough evolutionary time to build specialized psychology specifically for modern warfare. He argues complex war, this is on page 269, complex war is made possible by our refined ability for coalitionary proactive aggression. Right? So that is what is being applied. And he said, and this contributes to obedience and hierarchy and so forth. I don't think he's resolved, how to understand modern warfare with reference to our evolved psychology of coalitionary proactive aggression, but he's suggesting that there may be some utility. It may be useful to think about modern warfare, as sort of the application of an evolved psychology for ancestral raiding. And he's using this application as a means of predicting some of the problems that can arise in modern warfare that you just don't get in coalitional proactive aggression in hunter-gatherer raids.
Right. I think that makes sense, especially with the sort of blind confidence of the leaders, and sending the soldiers to fight against sort of overwhelming odds. I think
Right.
that makes sense.
Right. And I think there's something to be said for that profound disconnect between the commanding leadership in modern warfare and the soldiers, the boots on the ground, the grunts, the guys actually doing the killing. I mean, the commanders have a job to do. And it's almost like they're able to move these pieces around. And these pieces, these soldiers are not their sons or brothers. There's a disconnect in terms of the commitment, the familial commitment that would have been typical of our ancestral past, that makes possible these sorts of phenomena that have terrible consequences in modern warfare that are unlikely, to occur in ancestral contexts.
Right.
So, all right, so let's look at chapter 13, this concluding chapter then. He sort of opens up by reminding us that Rousseauians say we are a naturally peaceful species corrupted by society. Hobbesians see us as a naturally violent species civilized by society. Both perspectives make sense. To say that we are both naturally peaceful and naturally violent, however, can seem contradictory. Okay, the mismatch created by that combination represents the paradox at the heart of this book. The paradox is resolved if we recognize that human nature is a chimera. The chimera in classical mythology was a creature with the body of a goat and the head of a lion. It was neither one thing nor the other. It was both. The thesis of this book, Wrangham reminds us, is that with respect to our tendency for aggression, a human being is both a goat and a lion. We have a low propensity for reactive aggression and a high propensity for proactive aggression. The solution makes Rousseauians and Hobbesians both partially right and raises the two questions I have discussed. Why did this unusual combination evolve, and how does the answer contribute to understanding ourselves? That is the book he has written, and that is essentially what he's doing here is summarizing the book in this final chapter, summarizing sort of the main ideas. Focusing on the importance of the evolution of language. With language, you get the evolution of gossip and moral concern. Why are people concerned? Why is language used? I mean, in part, it's designed to organize coalitionary proactive aggression to eliminate troublemakers, that is, to execute. Okay, those that threaten the stability of the social group.
Yeah.
And as a consequence, we have people today, modern humans, who are, self-domesticated or domesticated. Okay, we are remarkably tolerant, of others, of our own group. Okay, we are very low in reactive aggression when it comes to members of our own group. But we also have, as a consequence, a psychology that motivates coalitionary, proactive aggression, planful aggression, to remove troublemakers.
And does he also, I can't remember, does he stress the importance of language also in working in coordination with our low reactive aggression, to the effect that we're able to cooperate at a group level in ways that were important for basically us forming civilizations and large scale societies.
Absolutely. And he makes I think the very worthwhile point that cooperation in and of itself isn't necessarily good or morally righteous. Slaughterhouses and concentration camps, require unbelievable cooperation to produce unbelievable horrors. And so, but it's just that it's language that's enabled this kind of cooperation, both for good and for bad.
Right.
That's right. Okay, so maybe we can just say a couple of words on the afterword. Do you sort of summarize your take on the afterword?
Uh, Basically, it's Wrangham saying that. I mean, he's hinted at this argument throughout the book, and I think especially
Yeah.
in the chapter on war, talking about things that are evolved or a part of our evolved psychology are not necessarily good, and they also don't have to be inevitable. We don't have to be sort of shackled to our evolved psychology or behavior, and he's applying that to capital punishment largely. So that's sort of been a big part of this book, is that humans sometimes execute problematic group members, and this is, just, I know we just talked about war, but restricting it to sort of in-group execution of problematic group members. And what Wrangham is arguing is that he pretty staunchly believes that capital punishment is a societal ill, and that he hopes that in the future more and more countries will continue the trend of uh, banning or forbidding capital punishment as a sentence for criminals.
Right. Despite the fact that that very capital punishment produced, according to his argument, modern humans.
Right, exactly.
So, right. I mean, so he's asking the reader to very carefully appreciate that just because execution produced, modern humans that are capable of this wonderful, let's just stay focused on wonderful, sort of morally defensible cooperative ventures, does not therefore mean that capital punishment is a moral good. It does not mean that therefore it should be allowed or should be continued. In fact, he's arguing quite the opposite. Despite the fact that capital punishment, that is execution, troublemakers, recurrently over our evolutionary past, despite the fact that it has produced our ability to do tremendous cooperative good, he's arguing that it is not a defensible punishment in the modern world, that we do have prisons, we do have the ability to exact punishments or, levy fines, on wrongdoers, short of killing them.
Right.
So good. I thought it was important for him to, include that last couple of pages in the afterword, because I think people will jump to the conclusion that he's sort of advocating capital punishment as a good.
Right.
Right. Okay, very good. Any other comments or questions or concerns you wanted to raise, Gavin?
No, I'm good.
Okay, and so in this final week, we're asking the students to check out a final video, and I can't find my syllabus now. Here it is. It's
Paul Bloom's lecture on
Yep.
just babies.
Yep, and this is basically, so it's not a TED Talk. It's a lecture, and it's based on, Paul Bloom is a psychologist, and I think he might, I don't know if he'll refer to himself as an evolutionary psychologist, but he certainly applies evolutionary thinking to psychology, and specifically to child psychology and developmental psychology. And this talk is based on a book by the same title called Just Babies, kind of a play on just. That is, it's a book that addresses the developmental origins of morality in humans, and it's inspired in part by some of his own work on the evidence for morality in infants. And he makes the case that human babies, are moral beings, that essentially we come into the world eager to, to do moral good, to punish moral wrongs. And this is his talk that sort of summarizes this particular book. And so he's a great speaker, and it's a great talk. And so we're encouraging you to watch this final video to sort of reflect on the application of evolutionary thinking to moral psychology in general and to the origin and development of moral psychology in humans in particular. So very good. Gavin will be sending out a Moodle message with links to that video.
Yep.
And shortly, as explained or as described in your syllabus, you will receive a Moodle message with the final exam. And you will have 1 week to complete that final exam, and we'll look forward to receiving drafts and are happy to respond to questions and concerns that you have about the final exam, which will be due about 1 week after you receive it.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, very good. That's it for today then. And we good? Anything further?
Nope, I'm all right.
Okay, so is this our sign-off then for this class?
Yes, this will be our last video for this class.
Okay, good. So we hope you've enjoyed reading these two books, Dawkins and then Wrangham. I think it's safe to say that there are lots of unanswered issues and questions, but I think that's, in part the mark of a good book. It gets you thinking and it might answer a few questions here and there, but, certainly, as I hope Gavin and I have demonstrated, there are lots of questions that remain.
Right.
So thank you very much, and until we see you again.
Yep.
Thanks.